the ancient Romans ran on routine, balancing work, discipline, and leisure with precision. Every hour had a purpose, whether for duty, exercise, or relaxation, shaping an empire built on efficiency and resilience. So, what did a typical Roman day look like, and how can we steal their best habits? In the eternal city of Rome, the day began before the sun rose over the horizon. The city stirred to life in a symphony of sounds, merchants setting up their stalls, blacksmiths hammering metal, and the distant shouts of street vendors. Sleeping in was a luxury few could afford, whether due to the demands of work or the relentless noise of the crowded streets where horses clattered, carts rumbled, and voices filled the air long before dawn. Morning routines were swift and efficient, with people diving straight into their daily tasks. Farmers set off for the fields at dawn. Farmers left for the fields early, while city workers navigated the crowded streets filled with merchants and officials. As the city grew, its streets became more congested, with narrow alleys and frequent fires shaping its layout. To reduce traffic, carts were banned from the streets during the day, forcing travelers to leave their wagons at the city gates and navigate the maze on foot, a challenge in itself. Only building contractors, favored by Emperor Caesar's decree, were allowed to navigate the streets with their carts. The rest had to make their way through the crowded streets, joining the flow of people heading toward the Roman Forum to start their day. The Roman Forum wasn't just a marketplace, it was the city's beating heart. Politics, business, and daily life all converged here. Orators delivered fiery speeches from podiums, priests made sacrifices to the gods, and emperors, carried in chariots, basked in the adoration of the masses. Meanwhile, merchants haggled, gossips spread the latest rumors, and everyday Romans wandered the bustling square. Can you imagine the noise? The poet Martial described it vividly. The laughter of the passing throng wakes me, and Rome is at my bed's head. Schoolmasters in the morning do not let you live. Before daybreak, bakers, the hammers of the coppersmiths all day. For the wealthy, finding peace was a daily battle. They retreated deep into their villas, shielded by thick walls and lush gardens. But even there, they weren't safe from the morning chaos. At dawn, a bell signaled the servants into action. Still half asleep, they grabbed buckets, cloths, ladders, and feather dusters, launching a war on dust. Sawdust was spread to soak up dirt, then quickly swept away. Pillars were scrubbed, silver polished, and every last spiderweb cleared. If an important guest was expected, the master of the house might storm through the halls, barking orders, sometimes even brandishing a whip to ensure everything was flawless. The rush, the tension, the frantic energy, you can almost feel it. Some, like Roman lawyer Pliny the Younger, designed their homes with long corridors to block out the noise. But how many Romans truly escaped the city's unrelenting buzz? In a world of constant movement, was silence even possible? Life in Rome wasn't all work, though. For the wealthy, the day was a balance of business and pleasure. But they weren't exactly pulling long shifts. The workday started at dawn and ended by noon. A day in the life of an elite Roman man wasn't too different from today. Structured, busy, and full of obligations. But unlike the average citizen, he lived in a world of power and privilege, carefully separated from the masses. His day began before sunrise. Why so early? Because it ended early, too. After a simple breakfast, which was often just a glass of water, he handled private affairs. He reviewed accounts, met with managers, and made important decisions about his household and business. Some, like Roman statesman Cicero and Roman author Pliny the Elder, used these quiet morning hours for writing, while poet Horace described lawyers giving free legal advice as early as 3 in the morning. Then came the salutatio, a key social ritual. Clients arrived at his home, paying their respects and seeking favors or advice. But if he had a wedding to attend, a child's naming ceremony, or a friend's son coming of age, he might skip the salutatio altogether. These life events all took place in the early morning, too. Afterward, he headed to the forum, carried in a litter and accompanied by his entourage, including a nomenclator who was simply a personal assistant who whispered the names of important people to help him remember. The courts and the Senate got to work around the 3rd hour and ran until late afternoon, but never past sunset. The artificial lighting in Rome was so poor that even the wealthiest preferred to maximize daylight. Pliny the Elder even had a saying, "To live is to be awake." The Romans took this to heart. Sleeping in was a luxury reserved for the young partygoers or the unfortunate souls nursing a hangover from the night before. And then came the afternoons, when the whole routine took an unexpected turn. But before we dive into that, if you're enjoying the video, make sure to like and subscribe for more fascinating ancient Romans content. Afternoons in ancient Rome meant one thing: prandium, the midday meal. Food was a necessity for all Romans, but what they ate depended heavily on their wealth. Much like housing, diet reflected a person's economic status. For the poor, survival often meant waiting for the monthly grain allotment. Can you imagine relying on a government handout just to have bread on your table? For the average Roman, the prandium simply consisted of moritum, a herb and cheese spread much like modern pesto, fresh fruits, and posca, a vinegar-based drink made from fermented grapes or other fruits. But for the wealthy, lunch was an opportunity to flaunt their status. Imagine dining on roasted peacock, a symbol of luxury, or indulging in gustaccio, an appetizer platter of dormice, snails, and oysters. Strange? Maybe. But is it really so different from today, where the ultra-rich dine on rare truffles, caviar, and gold-covered steaks? The wealthy Romans were just as eager to impress with their extravagant meals. But you see, for most Romans, the main meal of the day was in the late afternoon, between 4 and 6. Breakfast and lunch, barely more than snacks, sometimes just a piece of bread. And if you're picturing classic Italian cuisine, think again. Early Rome had no potatoes, tomatoes, corn, peppers, rice, or sugar. No oranges, grapefruits, apricots, or peaches either. So what did they mainly eat? The rich dined on exotic meals seasoned with imported spices, served by slaves, while they lounged on plush cushions. The poor, however, made do with cereals, bread, vegetables, and olive oil. Meat was a rare luxury, unless a sacrifice had been made to the gods. After all, only the internal organs were burned in offerings, leaving the rest of the meat up for grabs. As for drinks, wine was the go-to beverage. But don't picture a luxurious goblet of fine red wine, especially for the lower classes. Their wine was often watered down, and those who couldn't afford it drank from the public fountains. After lunch came the meridiatio, the midday rest. Work paused until the 8th hour, except in law courts and the Senate. On public holidays, business stopped entirely as Romans flocked to theatres, the circus, or grand spectacles. The upper class, however, often avoided these lively gatherings, retreating instead to their country estates for peace and quiet. By mid-afternoon, Rome itself seemed to do the same. The blazing Mediterranean sun beat down on stone buildings, turning the city into a furnace. Markets emptied, shops shut their doors, and the usual noise of merchants, officials, and crowds faded into silence. Even the Forum, the heart of Roman political and business life, slowed to a standstill as people retreated indoors to courtyards, shaded rooms, or bathhouses, waiting for the heat to subside. But as the sun dipped lower, the city stirred back to life. Some shops reopened, but the Forum remained empty because afternoons weren't for work. They were for leisure. Gladiatorial matches, chariot races, wrestling, theatre, and the ever-popular public baths. Entertainment was woven into daily life. And while the wealthy indulged in luxury, the government ensured the poor were entertained too. Even in times of crisis, Rome's leaders understood one thing: keep the people fed and entertained, and they won't rebel. And so, as the heat faded, Romans sought out thrill and spectacle. Some crowded the theatres for a play. Others rushed to the Circus Maximus to watch heart-pounding chariot races. But nothing compared to the brutal, breathtaking spectacle of the Colosseum. Think gladiators were the only attraction. Far from it. The Colosseum hosted a variety of shows. Skilled hunters battling exotic beasts from across the empire, grand executions, and, on rare occasions, namache, mock naval battles, where the arena floor was flooded to recreate legendary sea clashes. As the action unfolded, vendors sold snacks like almonds, quinces, plums, and pomegranates. Can you imagine sitting in the stands, munching on fruit while watching a lion take down a warrior? But what if there were no games that day after a long day of work? Or, let's be real, a long morning of work. Romans needed to unwind. And where did they go? Romans didn't sit around bored. They strolled through the city, gambled, exercised, or visited the thermae, basically public bathhouses that were the heart of social life. By 33 BCE, Rome had 170 public baths, and by 400 CE, that number had skyrocketed to over 800. Then, by Pliny the Elder's time, Rome had thousands of them. These were more than just places to get clean. They had gyms, health centers, and sometimes even brothels for the wealthier patrons. And let's talk about size. Emperor Diocletian's bathhouse was massive. Covering 32 acres, it had lavish gardens, sculptures, fountains, and even a running track. It could even accommodate 3,000 guests at once. Can you imagine a place that big just for relaxing? Unlike today, Romans didn't bathe in the morning or evening, and most homes didn't even have baths. Instead, people gathered at the thermae in the afternoon, scrubbing off the day's grime while chatting, networking, and relaxing. Bathing wasn't just about hygiene, it was a social ritual, a duty, and sometimes a scandal. Early Roman baths had no rules on nudity or gender separation, and anything could happen in the steamy chambers. Some women were so uncomfortable with the situation that female-only baths were created. Eventually, Emperor Hadrian put an end to the mixed bathing controversy, forcing men and women to bathe separately. But one has to wonder, was it really about modesty, or just another way to control social behavior? But did you know the best part about these bathhouses? Well, entry was practically free. Children got in at no cost, while adults paid about half a cent, a tiny fee for access to an incredible experience. These thermae had something for everyone: hot baths, cold baths, steam rooms, and even swimming pools. But bathing was just the beginning. Many bathhouses also featured enclosed gardens, promenades, and exercise areas where Romans played sports. They had a version of tennis, played by striking the ball with their hands instead of rackets, and a rough, rugby-like game called harpastum. The engineering behind these baths was remarkable. Water was brought in through aqueducts and heated by massive furnaces hidden under floors and inside walls. The result? A warm, welcoming retreat where Romans could spend hours unwinding. But no one stayed until closing. The baths shut at sundown, but most people left earlier. After all, the biggest event of the day was still to come: supper. And, considering the variety in Roman diets, that could mean anything from a simple bowl of porridge to an extravagant banquet featuring exotic dishes. For the wealthy, supper wasn't just a meal, it was an experience. While breakfast was just water and lunch was sometimes a quick bite of bread, cheese, and cold cuts, dinner was a grand affair. Lavish feasts could last anywhere from 1 to 4 hours, and extravagant emperors sometimes kept the party going past midnight. Unlike today, where most homes have standard dining rooms with tables and chairs, Roman dining rooms, triclinia, were designed for luxury and leisure. Instead of sitting upright, diners lounged on reclining couches arranged around a square table, defying gravity as they ate while propped up on one arm. Can you imagine eating an entire meal lying down? And hospitality. It was a big deal, inviting guests over. You, as the host, were expected to provide knives and spoons, not for eating, but for preparing and serving food. Romans dined primarily with their hands, so meals were served in bite-sized portions. Hand-washing was a must before and after eating, and even between courses, a practice still considered good etiquette today. A proper Roman supper had at least 7 courses: hors d'oeuvres, 3 entrees, 2 roasts, and a dessert. But the real showstoppers were the exotic dishes. Imagine nibbling on dormice rolled in honey and poppy seeds, or savouring a suckling pig stuffed with dates. The ultimate delicacy, the red mullet, a fish so rare and expensive that serving it could financially ruin a host. Would you risk bankruptcy for the sake of impressing your guests? And then, of course, there was the wine. Lots of it. Romans enjoyed varieties blended with honey, resin, and pine pitch. But drinking wine straight, without dilution, That was considered extreme and even a sign of poor character. While wealthy patricians were known for their extravagant feasts, plebeians, the common folk, valued simplicity and etiquette. In fact, one Pompeii resident even had dining rules painted on his wall as a reminder of proper behavior. Among them, spare thy neighbour's wife lascivious glances and ogling flatteries, and let modesty dwell in thy mouth. Be amiable and abstain from odious brawlings if thou canst. If not, let thy steps bear thee back again to thine own home. It seems dinner parties could get out of hand, and if things turned sour, the best advice was to leave fast. But leaving wasn't always simple. If a banquet stretched late into the night, getting home was no easy task. Roman nights weren't lively with streetlights and bustling crowds. They were dark, silent, and often dangerous. Roman historian Jerome Carcopino described it best as, "Night fell over the city like the shadow of a great danger. Everyone fled to his home, shut himself in, and barricaded the entrance. The shops fell silent. Safety chains were drawn across doors. The shutters of the flats were closed, and the pots of flowers withdrawn from the windows they had adorned. Wealthy guests were lucky, though. They were escorted home by slaves carrying torches, lighting the way and providing protection. But for everyone else, the streets were a gamble. There were no public oil lamps to guide the way. And though city watchmen patrolled from dusk till dawn, Rome was simply too vast to be fully guarded. But life in the countryside, oh, it was far more simple, yet demanding. Unlike the bustling streets of Rome, where merchants, politicians, and entertainers filled the day with activity, rural life revolved around hard work and self-sufficiency. Farmers and small-town dwellers relied almost entirely on their own labor, with little access to the luxuries or distractions of city life. But in the bustling cities of the Roman Empire, daily life followed a very different rhythm. Cities like Rome, Pompeii, Antioch, and Carthage were magnets for those seeking a better life. The promise of jobs drew many from rural areas, but reality often painted a different picture. What happened when people arrived, hoping for work? More often than not, they found nothing. The city was overflowing with people, and slaves dominated most professions, even as teachers, doctors, architects, and surgeons. For freedmen, options were limited to trades like baking, carpentry, or fishmongering, while poor women often worked as hairdressers, midwives, or dressmakers. But what if they couldn't find work? Many ended up homeless, struggling to survive in a city that had no place for them. Finding a home was the first challenge. Space was scarce, and affordable housing was practically non-existent. The solution? Insulae, massive apartment buildings that housed the majority of the population, including many middle-class citizens. By 150 BCE, Rome had over 46,000 of these buildings. But these weren't luxurious residences. They were overcrowded, poorly built, and incredibly dangerous. Residents lived in constant fear of fires, structural collapses, and even flooding from the Tiber River. Streets were narrow and often unpaved, making it nearly impossible for emergency aid to reach burning buildings. It took the Great Fire of Rome under Emperor Nero to push the government into action. Only then were streets widened and balconies added to improve safety. And if you think today's housing regulations can be ignored, Rome had the same issue. Though Emperors Augustus and Trajan passed laws to limit building heights to around 70 feet, landlords often ignored these restrictions. Some insulae were 5 to 7 stories high, towering over the narrow streets below. Accidents waiting to happen. In ancient Rome, poverty was impossible to ignore. It was evident in the way people dressed, the work they did, and most of all, in where they lived. These massive apartment blocks known as insula housed most of the city's population. But not all residents lived the same way. The wealthier tenants occupied the lower floors. These apartments were relatively comfortable, with multiple rooms, glazed windows, and even running water. Their rent was paid annually, and they enjoyed a degree of stability. But the higher you went, the worse the conditions became. The upper floors were cramped, often just a single room for an entire family. These rooms had no running water, no toilets, and barely any light. Imagine the summer heat trapped inside these tiny spaces, or the winter cold seeping through the walls. Worst of all, rent was paid daily or weekly, meaning eviction was a constant threat. While Rome had an advanced sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, it only benefited the lower floors. Those living higher up had no choice but to throw their waste onto the streets below. The result? A city that reeked of filth and became a breeding ground for disease. And if you think going outside was an option, think again. The streets were pitch dark at night. There were no streetlights and crime was rampant. Venturing out after sunset was dangerous, and many simply stayed indoors, enduring the decay and fear of fire, which could engulf an entire insula in minutes. Life in ancient Rome was a world of contrasts, where wealth determined not just comfort, but even basic rights. The elite who didn't escape to countryside villas resided in domus, luxurious city homes, often perched on Palatine Hill, near the imperial palace. But these weren't just places of relaxation. They were centers of business too. Many had shops at the front where owners conducted daily trade, while behind them lay grand reception halls called atria, complete with shrines to household gods and decorative pools that collected rainwater. Imagine walking into one of these homes, ornate columns, intricate mosaics, and the scent of fresh bread wafting from the kitchen. Wouldn't that be a sight to behold? Beyond these elegant homes, the paterfamilias, the male head of the household ruled with absolute authority. His word was law, and he could even reject his own children for reasons as arbitrary as their appearance or gender. Harsh, right? Over time, though, this power weakened, and families became less rigidly controlled. But the real surprise: Roman women gradually carved out their own freedoms. Initially confined to the home, they later gained rights to own property, attend public events, and even initiate divorce. Some even worked as bakers, pharmacists, and shopkeepers, far ahead of their time compared to many ancient societies. The Roman Empire was all about expansion, and that didn't just mean land. Cities like Antioch, Alexandria, Carthage, and even Carthago Nova, modern-day Cartagena, Spain, became heavily influenced by Roman culture. They weren't just adopting Roman customs. They were literally reshaped with amphitheatres, arenas, bathhouses, and basilicas. Pompeii alone had 3 municipal baths, 2 theatres, a basilica, and an amphitheatre. It seems like the Romans took their entertainment and leisure just as seriously as their conquests. Speaking of taking things seriously, did you know that during Emperor Claudius's reign, there were 159 official days off from work? That's almost half the year dedicated to leisure. But Marcus Aurelius, the ever-practical philosopher-emperor, decided that was a bit excessive and bumped it up to 230 days of business. The Romans have had a lasting influence on how we structure our daily lives, often in ways we don't even realize. From their early rising habits to their designated work hours, their routines set the foundation for many modern practices. Think about it. Most of us still start our workday in the morning and reserve the afternoons or evenings for leisure, much like the Romans did. Their strong work ethic, driven by ambition and social status, mirrors today's hustle culture, where success is often measured by productivity and dedication.